Hello, my misery and me. Okay, first of all, I praise your video, your comment in your video for identifying, yes, the subjective experience is the interesting part. The fact that we are a witness. I hesitate to call it a witness. I like to use the term Cartesian theater because Descartes described this general phenomenon. And you have to be careful. I mean, maybe we are the theater itself. Maybe there is no audience member. The audience member, I think, biases us to the subject-cause-predicate assumptions that we make about caused and causer. All right. You know, it's like when I push something across the table. It's not like I push it and then it moves afterwards. No, it moves when I push it. They're co-located in time. There's something, maybe a mistake, that we've separated those things too much. It's also similar to the idea of I think, therefore I am. Well, I think, you don't know that you're the one thinking. You could, and most likely material are better thought of as the product of thought. Your concept of I is the result of the brain thinking. It's not the cause of it thinking. So I'd rather not talk about the witness if we have to take that baggage. But this is the metaphor that we've used for so long, that as long as we're careful of not drawing too much meaning from that metaphor, we can use it as a word. We can talk about the subjective experience in the Cartesian theater without necessarily assuming whether we're cause, effect, the thing itself, whatever. Okay, now, one thing that gets the heart of this and the two-slit experiment is you said there's something and it's going to go left and right, and that's predetermined from the Big Bang. And that's just not the case. That's not what particle physicists have thought for 100 years. Okay, that's not how particle motions are thought of now. For example, let's say you have a hydrogen atom that's excited. So it's got a photon's worth of energy in it that it can release. Okay. And the electron shell that I'm signaling with my hand would collapse. And a photon will fly off. If a photon flies this way, it'll move that way a little bit. If a photon flies this way, it'll move the other way. So it's a right and left example. According to current quantum mechanics, right, not my interpretation, this is quantum mechanics, it is not determinable ahead of time which it is going to do. And the two-slit experiment demonstrates this as a material fact, because when you shoot one particle that has a possibility of going through either slit, both possibilities happen. When it gets to the screen, it only makes one speck out of a lot of possible specks that it might have made. It might have made a speck going through one slit or through the other. But the appearance of the interference pattern that they'll talk about if you read up on the two-slit experiment shows that both possibilities were there interfering with each other. And what we don't understand is when it hits the screen, how this so-called collapses into a particular location. Right. So, according to quantum mechanics, it's not true. It's not just a lack of knowledge that allows or that prevents us from knowing the future. It is fundamentally undetermined at this point. It will be determined. The process by which it comes to be is determined by things like the law of conservation of energy and whatever the relationships that could be represented as laws of all the fields and their interdependencies. Right, it gets determined, but you cannot tell ahead of time. It is not determined now from the current state. Our current state, according to quantum physics, could evolve into multiple different possible states from here. That's what quantum mechanics says. Now, there are people that said, tell me where all the initial velocities, all the particles are in the universe are, and I will tell you the future. That was a popular sentiment. You guys seem to have that sentiment. Perhaps it makes sense since they're still teaching up to the end of high school classical physics. So you have a mindset that's 100 years ago when the physicists themselves thought that. But for the last 100 years, physicists have thought quite differently. And they've been pretty mum on drawing too many philosophical conclusions because they got reamed on these other philosophical conclusions, like determinacy, like predeterminacy. Now you have to understand, in physics, people will talk about things being determined. And the statistics help generate this determinability. But one thing, it's not perfectly determinable. You just know what the statistic curve should look like. And in a particular case, contributing, it's not determinable at all. Because something could do, one particle can do something that's very unlikely. You don't know. But you know that only a certain percentage, plus or minus, are a certain likelihood to do something unlikely. And every step of the way, there can always be an outlier. You know, you're going to say, oh, well, only 20% of the things could be in these unlikely areas, and you'll find out it's 20.1%. So they're not hard limits. They're fuzzy because of this type of indeterminacy. And this is the important thing about quantum mechanics, that this field is holding something that is akin to probability. It's not that it has to be made up of a stuff called probability, no, but it has to be some sort of a field which maps to what we consider possibilities. From the point of view of quantum mechanics, everything's still determinable, right? Because what's determined is waves. There's an electron wave flying along. When the electron is in that bubble form, this big around that atom, before it collapses, it's stable. That's the real thing, when it's in this wave form, when it's in this field. But to us, it maps to probability, to possibility, right? Because we're only going to see one photon shoot off. So we're the ones that are seeing a limited cross-section of the possibilities, and why we follow one possibility or another becomes the same question of how come we have choices? How come there's paths and we can go various ways? When from the physics, it looks like all the ways are explored. All right, now consciousness is this subjective question, and it's interesting to me that you can ask questions about it and say how you understand that it's making these choices. But if you have to define the word choice, I don't see how you're going to do it if there's not an option, right? Now, you said consciousness is just maybe remembering, and you wondered about that idea. I believe that. I believe most of what our consciousness does is justify what the rest of our brain did. But willing and consciousness are not actually one-to-one, I don't believe. I believe you could have subconscious willing, and yet there's another meaning of unconscious, like anesthesia makes you unconscious, where you might not be doing either one of those things. But you're still doing, you know, you're still pumping blood. So, what does choice mean, you know? If a computer is choosing something, that's very different from when you're talking about choosing something. So, maybe you say, well, they're similar. Well, I'm a programmer, and when you program, the closest you could get to a choice is to say, you know, if X is greater than some number, greater than 10, then do the first action. Otherwise, do the other action. That's the closest to a choice where its hinges absolutely on some condition. Right? It doesn't look like a choice. It's a pathway where you're slotted and you react to something that you measure at that moment. Now, is that the kind of choice that we have as human beings? I don't know. And I do believe that a lot of what we've done is already that there's these single cells creatures known as neurons that are all hooked together, and they hum along in our subconscious, not in our conscious mind, and make decisions that our conscious mind just becomes aware of and justifies. The will isn't totally free, and the conscious part might not be free at all. And still, the illusion of choice comes from the will part. Our conscious mind comes up with theories about, well, how come it seems to be able to do these 2 or 3 different things? It seems to be able to choose. And I believe that the strongest place I found to apply our will is not in the middle of something going on, an action. When action is called for, things seem to just fall. You know, people find they act like their parents when they're surprised by some situation with their children, for example. The dominoes are already set up, but the greatest place that my will seems to be useful is in setting up the dominoes. When the action isn't happening, if I reflect on these kinds of situations in the past, when a future situation comes along, which it might never happen, but if a future situation like that comes along, my dominoes, my automatic reactions are going to be set up differently. In other words, it's as if my conscious mind can travel around in my subconscious, not unconscious, but subconscious mind, and set things up. And then when the shit hits the fan, tick, 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 I'm having an influence on what happens. Or maybe I could set things up so that even though I don't have a lot of will at the given last moment, maybe that's all, I can set it up so it won't take a lot to make the right decision. Okay, cheers.